Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation, Native Bees and Me. I'll be your host. I'm James Stevenson. I'm with the Pinellas County Parks and Conservation Resources here in Pinellas County, Florida. So the bees that we'll look at today are our native species. And we're going to talk native bees and me and native bees and thee. So what you can do to help conserve these incredibly important and often overlooked little tiny wildlife. Like I said, I'm with the Parks and Conservation Resources here in Pinellas County, Florida. I'm coming to you from Brooker Creek Preserve. Many of the photographs in today's presentation were taken right here at the preserve, proving how important preserves are in maintaining the health and well-being of our important wildlife, even the little tiny invertebrates. Pinellas County is the first county in the state of Florida to be a member of Bee City USA, and that is a conservation effort exactly for today's subject, our native bee species that are threatened, they're in decline, and there are things that we can do to help with their survival. This presentation could not have been possible without the expertise of two of my very good friends, Liz and Clint. Liz is the education coordinator at the Weeden Island Preserve Cultural and Natural History Center. Liz does a number of presentations and hikes that center around miniature wildlife, including insects, birds, and beyond. Our sister preserve is Weeden Island at the coast in southern Pinellas County. And Clint, who has sadly moved on to another state, was our resident native bee expert, a tireless explorer and an incredible photographer. Many of the best photographs in today's presentation are here thanks to Clint. So let's get into this topic. What we're going to look at today in about an hour is our local bees, our native bees. And what I hope to surprise you with is just how many and how diverse our native bee population is. We'll see what bees like. How can we make the world a better place for bees? How can we make the world more like the world that they grew up with? We'll look at some plants for bees. Everybody loves to grow plants. Why not grow plants for a purpose and provide for native bees and the best practices to keep our native bees healthy? This little tiny, tiny carpenter bee is going to get us started. And look, she's looking at us like, you see those little mandibles she's got? She's not going to bite you. We are recording this presentation, FYI. We're doing our very best with a new platform. You might have noticed if you've been with us before on our recorded webinars that we're using a different platform. We're using Teams, and we invite you to use the chat function if you have any questions, comments, or concerns throughout the presentation. Julie is here to monitor the chat and make sure if you're having any trouble that you'll get sorted out. And just so you know, we've included a few QR codes, those funny little boxy, pixelated black and white things. If you have your phone handy, you might want to get it and turn the camera on just in case you want to be redirected to a couple, three websites for further information about some of the topics we'll be covering today. So with that, let's just go ahead and get into it. Now, like I said, we are going to be looking at our native bees, those species that are found in Florida and some that are found only in Florida. We have about 300 different species of bees in Florida, including the beautiful blue mason bee that you see here. We're not talking about native bees today. I mean, we're not talking about honeybees today. Excuse me. We're not talking about honeybees today. Honeybees are not native bees. Honeybees arguably do not belong in the wild in Florida. Honeybees are an agricultural crop. They are managed, they are maintained, they are cared for, they are Just like any livestock, they're given medicine when they're sick, they're given housing, and they do produce copious amounts of honey, and they are important in the agricultural community for a certain amount of pollination of crops. They're a way that farmers can move pollinators to crops because honeybees are colonial. They live in big colonies. You might be aware they have a queen and thousands of worker bees, but they're not native. And they, in fact, compete with our native bees. So we're not anti honeybee, but honeybees have their own lobby. You know what I mean? They have their own PR. We're here to draw attention to the plight of our native bees. So you won't be hearing about honey today. The bees in Florida are primarily solitary. They don't live in hives. They don't live in great conglomerations. They don't make swarms. They just mind their own little business and go about their lives quietly pollinating our native plants and wildflowers. There's a wonderful um, fact sheet from the University of Florida IFAS extension called Bees of Florida. And if you'd like a copy of this, or if you'd like to reference this at any time, it's a great side-by-side comparison of just how different and how alike our native bees are. Here's the first of our QR codes. And if you want to, you can just aim your camera at this. You don't have to take a picture, I believe. If you just aim your camera at this QR code, it should take you to the website that'll link to that publication. A great color collection, color photograph collection of our native Florida bees. So we'll get started with some species. And aside from the honeybee, which just about everyone can recognize, we know the size of a honeybee, we know the color of a honeybee, and they certainly are abundant in our own landscapes, as they are established in wild colonies, in wild hives, in things like hollows of trees, in bird boxes, and bat boxes. They like to move into man-made structures. They don't have any problem with that. Aside from the honeybee, are probably the most easily recognized bee for normal people would be the bumblebees, the big, fuzzy, black and yellow jobs. This is the brown-belted bumblebee, and I suppose if you were brave enough, you could inspect this bee for its brown belt, but it's not that big. This is a wildly enlarged photograph. It's visiting pennyroyal. Pennyroyal is a native evergreen, very tiny shrub with very aromatic leaves that flowers in February. And the bumblebees are the first bees to get up and get to work in the spring. And of course, spring comes in January here in Central Florida. And the big bumblebees are the first to wake up. The queens, the fertile queens overwinter. They hibernate and wake up in February, and thank goodness there are plants like pennyroyal around to supply them with their nectar. Now, I did say that the majority of our native bees are solitary. They live by themselves and they just kind of go about their business. The bumblebees is our only native social bees, but they don't make huge hives of thousands of bees. They have more smaller colonies, maybe 50 to 500 bees at a time. A very, very productive queen could set up a colony in just 1 year of about 500 individuals, but generally they're more in the range of about 100 bees per colony. The queen who comes out in February and gets to work and raises her family of daughters that help her collect pollen and nectar that they feed the ensuing offspring, that goes on throughout the summer. And in the end of the year, the queen produces the next generation of queens. And if they're successfully mated by the males, they then will go to sleep and wake up the following. So each colony lives for just a year. And the bumblebees, as recognizable as they are, and as arguably charming as they are, we've seen a 90% decline in just the past 20 years. And this is due in part to habitat loss, habitat destruction, um, removal of their food source, which is wildflowers, and competition from the non-native species, which for the rest of the presentation will remain unnamed. There's several species of bumblebee. They all look pretty much alike. They're recognizable. They're fuzzy. Being fuzzy, they're excellent pollinators, as all of our native bees most of our native bees are. There's the eastern bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, the southern plains, and the two-spotted, but they all have the same body type. I want you to look closely at the size of their head. It's smaller than their shoulders. Do you see that? You can see that in this yellow-banded bumblebee, and perhaps here in the common eastern bumblebee. They have, a petite comparative to their body size, their head. Compare that to the big old carpenter bees. And there's several species of carpenter bees, and they've got these gigantic heads. You could mistake these for bumblebees because they too tend to be fuzzy. They tend to have, yellow fur collars, if you will, but their heads are massive. And the reason they have these massive heads is their heads are full of muscle. They're literal muscle heads. And they use that muscle to power these mandibles. You see these two big mandibles that she's got right here around her chin because as carpenters, they make holes in wood. They don't eat wood. They're not wood destroying insects. They just make burrows. They make tunnels where they raise their young. These can be incredibly large. This southern large carpenter bee is about 2 inches long. And this one does not have that furry yellow collar. She's pretty much all black. And they're much shinier. Their abdomens are much shinier than the bumblebees. So while they may have some fur around their thorax, this area here, they might have some hairs around there. Their abdomen, their butt is generally very shiny, and that's a good way to identify the carpenter bees. Some people consider carpenter bees a pest because they will put holes in treated lumber. The eaves of houses is one of their favorite places. And I suppose over time, they could do some damage or they could create a point of entry for moisture or perhaps some um, free-ranging termites, they might find their way in, but generally speaking, the action of a few carpenter bees isn't going to degrade the quality of a built structure. Here is an entry hole that has been created in treated lumber, so they don't mind that at all. And she uses those mandibles to create this tube into the side of some wood that's about 6 inches deep, maybe a little bit more, sometimes deeper, more like 12. Some of the carpenter bees are much smaller and they prefer ready-made hole. I mean, any bee would prefer ready-made domiciles. If they didn't have to chew through wood, maybe they wouldn't. And here's a little small carpenter bee examining a hollow stem. And hollow stems can be provided for native carpenter bees just by cutting your garden plants back to about 12 inches at the end of the year and let them overwinter just like that with these hollow stems, and they'll fill up with carpenter bees in the following spring. The males can be a little aggressive. The males will, even though they don't excavate the holes, they father the offspring and they get kind of moody about that and they chase away anybody that comes near their mate's domicile where she's raising her young. But the interesting thing about bees and wasps is that the stinger is a modified egg-laying structure. So the males do not have an egg-laying structure to modify. Therefore, the males cannot sting. They can't. They just can't. The male bees and wasps, they can't sting because they don't have any egg-laying things. Um, but they'll treat you pretty badly, the male carpenter bees. They're not going to hurt you at all. They just want you to kind of move along. Here's a couple of other hollow stems that can be great places for these carpenter bees to live. And here's some more information about how to provide nesting habitat for native bees through the plant stems in your garden. When you go to cut things with hollow stems back, maybe plant some plants with hollow stems. There's a list of plants available in this publication from NC State, North Carolina. A few of the plants, about half the plants in this publication, are suitable for growing here in Florida gardens. Another group of bees, in addition to the bumblebees and the carpenter bees, are the leaf cutter bees. Not cutting any leaves right here, just doing what bees do. Bees are basically vegetarian wasps. They live on flower nectar and they feed their babies primarily plant products. That would be nectar mixed with pollen. So bees work with pollen, they work with nectar, they eat the pollen, they eat the nectar, and they accidentally pollinate plants. It's not their main goal in life. Their main goal in life is to raise little baby bees. This leafcutter bee is visiting Palafoxia or Palafox, these little tiny tubular, and the bees with their very powerful tongues can reach down into the flowers and suck out the nectar. And in so doing, they get covered in pollen. Some of that pollen they collect and make bee bread with. This little leafcutter bee wants you to think that it's a carpenter. So it's shiny. It's got a shiny abdomen and kind of an oversized head, just as a mimic. The leafcutter bees have this tendency, this habit of carrying their pollen on their abdomen. And what you see here is a photo taken just this morning here at Brooker Creek in our butterfly garden of a compass plant producing these tiny little tubular flowers in the center of this bigger inflorescence. And this carpenter mimic leafcutter bee has got pollen right here on the underside of her abdomen. This bright yellow spot is a collection of pollen that she will use later on mixed with nectar to feed her offspring. Here at Brooker, we call these the diaper bees because they look like they're flying around with yellow diapers. That's where they carry their pollen. It's a habit of the leafcutter bees. This golden leafcutter bee looks very much like a honeybee, but what it's doing is nothing like anything a honeybee would ever do. You see what she's doing? She's making an incision, a almost perfect circular incision out of the side of a leaf. She's being a leaf cutter. She's using her mandibles to cut a circle of leaf tissue out of the edge of a leaf. And what is she doing with it? Maybe you've seen this. Maybe you've seen they look perfectly hole punched. If you're on a walk or a hike in the summer, check out some of the thin-leaved plants like this wild grape, and you might just see these almost perfect circular shapes. This isn't the work of a caterpillar. They're not that exacting, the caterpillars. These are leafcutter bees. And she takes those discs and makes something of a leaf burrito in a tube that has been either excavated by a carpenter bee and abandoned, or maybe the hollow stem of a hollow stemmed plant. She'll find any sort of a tube structure in nature and she will make this leaf burrito on the inside. And if you provide tubes made of natural bamboo, you might just attract leaf cutters to line your provision with circular bits of leaf. And she does this to provide a wonderful habitat for her offspring. Plants, as you may know, are unable to run away from danger. So plants are very good at producing all their own defense chemicals right where they sit. So plants, generally speaking, are naturally full of antibacterial and antifungal chemistry so that They don't need to get up and run to the doctor. They can stay right where they are and heal themselves. And these bees have taken advantage of that. They stuff just the right leaves into these tubes, and that allows a little bit more protection for their offspring when they lay their eggs inside these tubes and put some wonderful bee bread, which is a mixture of pollen and nectar to provide for their offspring, that mold doesn't start to grow and bacteria doesn't start to grow. So they make a very, very tidy and sterile place for their offspring to live. The mason bees do something similar, only not with cut pieces of leaves, but rather with cement. The mason bees deal in cement. They find mud puddles and they collect pieces of mud, just like the mud daubing wasps do. These mason bees will actually find tubular structures and they will make little concrete partitions in between each one of their offspring's individual chambers. So what we're seeing here, this partition is made of mud, which when it's dry, of course, is adobe. So these are the masonry bees or the adobe bees. And here's that mixture of nectar and pollen. And there's the egg. When the egg hatches, the little grub will eat all that wonderful uh, pollen is packed with protein, and of course, nectar is full of sugar. So, that sounds pretty good to me. Unfortunately, the female has to start at the back of the tube and lay the first egg and make the first provisions here, and then cordon that off, and then do another chamber, cordon it off, another chamber, and so on. Well, the first one to hatch is going to have to push its way through all of its sisters' little apartments. So it's not particularly elegant, but it works. It works for the blue orchard bee, and the blue orchard bee is so named because it's blue, and they're very important pollinators for fruit trees. And this is the only native bee that is managed like honeybees are managed because of their commercial value. The blue orchard bee is not in danger of extinction because they have been brought into agriculture and are thus um, protected and managed in that way. Here's another cross section of a natural hollow stem with the mason bee work you can see here as they have created these wonderful little chambers. Now, the cellophane bees or the masked bees are very, very elusive. They're small. This is a palmetto flower. And if you're familiar with the size of individual palmetto flowers, they're pretty small. And some of our bees are smaller than grains of rice. So, um, if you do choose to pursue native bees, you do need patience and excellent eyesight, or at least some sort of, augmentation for your eyesight. This masked bee appeared in a friend's garden just this week. Um, and you can see that very distinctive white patch on the front of her face. The cellophane bees are able to produce a substance which is very similar to plastic. It's weird. She makes it on her own. They don't collect pollen. They don't have any pollen collecting hairs. They have a different way of making a living. This cellophane bee, looking very bee-like with its stripes and its tongue, again, the vegetarian version of a wasp, are what defines the bees. The cellophane bees are ground nesting, and it's a great time to mention that most of these species that don't lay their eggs in tubes above ground excavate tunnels underground. And here's a diagram of a cross section of a cellophane bee system of tunnels where she's got these individual cells that again she packs with pollen and nectar combined, and then lines the whole um, outfit with this strange cellophane material. Just very peculiar. If you want to do some bee identification, you're going to have to learn the vocabulary. Otherwise, just go out and have a look in a pretty flower garden and enjoy the native bees. But if you really want to get into it, you're gonna need to examine things like the genitalia, the carina, the mesiepisternum, and the mediepisternum, and so on, and the malar length. It's its own discipline. It belongs to the bee experts, and we're glad they exist. We just enjoy looking at flowers and checking out bee butts, let's be honest. Here's a good, if you do want to dig into the biology of bees and their taxonomy and their identification, Professor Pascarella has The Bees of Florida. It's a photographic key that requires you to use a hand lens or a microscope to look at some of those microscopic or very hard to see features, a very intrusive and possibly impossible to do on a living bee. So just bear that in mind. And let's look at longhorn bees because the longhorn bees are just plain comedy. They've got these antennae, these very robust antennae that give them very expressive expressions. Here's a longhorn bee visiting fleabane, which is a little daisy flower that is pretty widespread, pretty easy to grow, considered possibly a weed. But if you look at it up close, it's a charming little daisy, a welcome addition to a smaller garden. The longhorn bees love the sunflower family, and the fleabane is a member of the sunflower family. Maybe you can see that it looks like a little miniature daisy. All the sunflowers, the bidens, beach sunflower, annual sunflowers, they're specialists. They love that whole group of flowers. So you plant your garden with zinnias and marigolds and sunflowers, you might just be able to attract some of these comedy longhorn bees. Here's a pair of sleeping longhorn bees, and these two males are sharing a stick. They've used their little mandibles to chomp down on a stick, and they've gone to bed for the evening, and they're safe in each other's antenna. Isn't that adorable? This photograph by our very own Liz got first prize in a photo contest here in Pinellas County. It's a really sweet little intimate look at a pair of our native bees at rest. One of the longhorn bees is actually called the sunflower bee, and it's Savastra. It's a genus name that I particularly love, Savastra. But this photograph by our very own Clint gives you a really good look at the hairs that bees are known to have, and just the amount of pollen that is sloppily carried by their hairy bodies. And that is what makes them such excellent pollinators for plants. They can't be neat and tidy enough to keep all the pollen that they collect in their scopal hairs. It just gets everywhere and it makes bees perfect pollinators. But again, the bees could care less whether the plants get pollinated. They just want the pollen to eat and to feed their young. But in so doing, by being so hairy and oftentimes so clumsy, they just make themselves excellent pollinators. The sweat bees are so called because, now don't freak out, some species of sweat bees will approach, they're very small, they're about the size of 2 grains of rice or maybe a kernel of wild rice. They will come up and inspect you, and if it's a particularly hot day, they might take a taste or two of your sweat. They want the salt. Imagine living on a diet of nectar. I mean, sounds great, but eventually you'll want a salty snack, right? Well, salt is kind of hard to come by in nature, but here we are, mammals sweating, and the sweat bees will actually come, and they know a good thing when they see it, and they can supplement their nutritional needs by taking a taste of our sweat. Most don't visit humans. Most you will not be insulted by any sweat bees, but there are plenty of other halictid bees. These are the metallic bees. And if you've ever seen any of the shiny green bees, these represent the little sweat bees. This is a very bad picture that I took again just this morning of one of our most common native bees, very common, very easily identified with that green metallic body and the striped abdomen. It's the brown-winged striped sweat bee, and I have never been bothered by a brown-winged metallic sweat bee. This is a bee that we captured with a net and put in the refrigerator. She got real chilled, literally gave us an opportunity to take some photographs, take a look at her scopal hairs and her pollen collection here. And once she warmed up, she flew off again, no problem. Here's another of the brown-winged striped sweat bees from just this week here at Brooker Creek. She's visiting one of our native thistles. This is Nuttall's thistle, a great plant to include in your garden. It attracts all sorts of bees. Our probably our most common native bee, most widely distributed and most often encountered is Poe's furrow bee, and its name calls attention to the fact that this is another one of the burrowing bees, as most of our native bees are. Poe's furrow bee has a big head, small striped body, and just works the flowers, loves the composites, just like the sunflower bee does. Clint took this photograph of this sweat bee adjacent called the anomia bee. And I just want to call attention to the fantastic color of the stripes on her abdomen. They are opalescent and they do actually iridesce in the sunlight. So I would love to see this bee. She's busy opening the flower of milk pea, which is widely distributed in more scrubby habitats. It's a legume that lays across the ground. And what Clint noticed when he was taking this picture, as this bee was stuffing her face into this flower, her back legs were scratching the flower petals. And after the bee flew away, after about an hour, everywhere where the bee had insulted the flower petals, each one of the scratches was turning a violet blue color, which could very well be indicating to this bee or to her relatives not to bother, that that flower had already been visited and all the nectar was gone. So isn't that cool? Requires a little bit more research. Smallest of bees, one of the smallest of bees, this little Dialectus bee. I can tell you that the size of this flower, all the petals of this flower would lie comfortably on your little fingernail, your smallest fingernail. This flower is no bigger than that. So this bee is incredibly small. Little tiny metallic sweat bee, just an absolute adorable little thing. There are a few bees that have abandoned their vegetarian lifestyle. Bees as a group of insects originated as wasps and then became vegetarian, fed their young that mixture of pollen and nectar. And some bees have gone back to the dark side. And these are the cuckoo bees or the kleptoparasites. And instead of collecting pollen to feed her young, she doesn't. Doesn't she look kind of like a wasp as well? It's probably for a reason. Um, this bee, the nomad bee, actually looks for the burrows of our native solitary bees, and she watches them to leave the house for work, and then she goes down in there and lays her eggs in the den, in the nesting cavities of the um, of the other bee species, and then her young eat the babies of the original inhabitant and the nectar and the pollen. So it's not Snow White out there, even in the bee community. Here's a nomad bee we just took a picture of right after lunch, busy on a coffee plant, living her best life, just living for herself. Another one of the cuckoo bees, again, looking very wasp-like, is the long-horned cuckoo bee. At the end of the year, when the fall wildflowers are out, like this honeycomb head balduina, we get to see the sweetest little bees, the fairy bees. Um, they really are cute, and they don't even have the ability to sting. They couldn't if they wanted to. Our other native bee species can defend themselves, do have stingers, do um, defend if they are absolutely insulted, but you really have to try and get stung. Um, with the mining fairy bees, they couldn't if they wanted to. So these are definitely worth investigating towards the end of the year. Again, they're like little flying grains of rice, the little fairy bees. So what do bees want? They just want lots to eat. They want a nice place to live. They don't want the competition from non-native introduced honeybees. If you want to provide for native bees, pretty much the same as you would do if you provide for butterflies that barely do any pollination at all, by the way. But do the same. Provide nectar everywhere because different bee species are going to want to forage maybe at different levels, from the ground to the mid to up high in the tree branches. So, flowering trees, mid-sized shrubs, and little ground covers. It's just like we would design a landscape anyway, but if you do it intentionally for the bees, remember to include a lot of diversity, not just different colors of the same flower, but many different species. So you have a year-long supply of nectar and pollen for our native bees, as well as different flower shapes, because different species are going to feed on different flower shapes. And that can change throughout the year depending on the species. So, providing the most diversity is best. Some flowers are open and bowl shaped, like this native wildflower called the pine barren frostweed. It makes a little shrubby native evergreen with these great big wide open flowers, nice and bowl shaped. Some flowers make funnel shaped, like the native Ruellia, also called the wild petunia. Petunias themselves make funnel shaped leaves. And look who's waiting right here. Look who's waiting right here, camouflaged. It's a crab spider. Nothing you can do about that. It's life, isn't it? Anyway, funnel-shaped, bowl-shaped, brush-shaped flowers like those that belong to the red maple makes a brush-shaped flower. The bees like to brush their tummies across the top here and collect up all that pollen, and meanwhile stick their face down in the little, uh, almost miniature petaled flowers of the red maple. Other brush-shaped flowers, of course, the sunshine mimosa. That's a lot of fun for bees to climb all over and stick their face down in to get the nectar that they have to get through all those pollen-bearing structures to get there. There are gullet-shaped flowers that take a little bit of work. The work to crawl to the back of a violet flower is worth it because there's a lot of nectar back there. And it belongs only to that bee that's strong enough to climb in there. This violet even paints a little runway signal, a little, this way to nectar. Those are referred to as gullet-shaped flowers. And some flowers, like we saw before with that legume that the um, Nomia bee was pulling open, they need to be physically opened by the bee. So the flowers kind of keep their treasure hidden until just the right pollinator comes along. And this big bumblebee is certainly strong enough to prise open the petals of an iris to get to the nectar, to get to the pollen, and in so doing, ensures that the iris only gets pollinated by something that's big enough to go from one species to the same species and pull that flower open. Any garden that's full of composite flowers is going to have lots and lots and lots of bees. This is the compass plant, Silphium, and each sunflower um, is actually a whole lot of tiny tubular flowers all packed on a small space. So sunflowers and gaillardia, all those, um, who's the thing called goldenrod, an excellent composite flower, absolutely covered in pollinators. And the composite flowers, because they're insect pollinated, they make sticky pollen that sticks to fuzzy bodies. They don't release their pollen into the air where it could get into our noses. So none of these flowers that are insect pollinated are going to bother your nose. Here are two roses, our native rose, the swamp rose, and we do have some roses that have been improved by people. Um, and all of their reproductive bits have been turned into extra petals. So we would say definitely grow roses in your garden as long as they are the wild type roses, the species roses, like Rosa palustris, and not those that don't have any reproductive structures whatsoever because they're not producing pollen and they're not producing nectar. So they're just a waste of space and water, if you ask me. What plants in particular? Well, let's give you a hint of some plants that you might want to grow to get started attracting bees if you haven't done that already. The Chickasaw plum is a plant, it's a small tree. It's actually suitable for planting underneath power lines, so at the perimeter of your property. The Chickasaw plum, Prunus angustifolia and Prunus umbellata are both these things called hog plum, and they flower very early in the season, and they're great for those early emerging females that are just starting off their colonies for the year. Here's a close-up. It's just like a crabapple, just like a cherry. It's in the same genus, in fact, as cherry. So it's cherry flowers, and yes, they do make fruit. Maybe not suitable for a feast or a banquet, but you know, what fun would it be to grow some wild plums in your own yard? We have Walter's viburnum here at the preserve. It was planted as a landscape plant because it is a Florida native, but it also makes a satisfying foundation planting. It's an mostly evergreen, small leaves so it doesn't make a mess, lots and lots of flowers in January and February. Again, great nectar and pollen source for those early emerging native bee species. It also attracts an interesting bee mimic or hummingbird mimic. It's a moth that flaps its wings just like a hummingbird. It has these great big long horns like a longhorned bee, and it even has stripes. It really wants you to think that it packs a punch, but it's just a soft, um, fluffy moth. An interesting addition. Saw palmetto, if you're not familiar, is an extremely heavily flowered shrub. When saw palmetto flowers, it doesn't cut any corners. Millions of tiny white flowers that get covered in the most interesting pollinators, bees, moths, butterflies, beetles, and beyond. Here's a planting of saw palmetto at the edge of someone's yard. We have a line drawn through this what's that thing called Schefflera? Pay no attention to the Schefflera. We're not interested in that. It's an invasive plant. But anyway, moving on. There are dwarf palmettos for smaller spaces. You can see here it had an inflorescence that's now going into fruit. They don't take up much space at all, and they do still produce those millions of flowers. Um, the Lyonias and the Iteas, both small shrubs that are suitable for an irrigated landscape. These are native plants that are found naturally in low-lying areas and in swamps and flooded forests. So they don't love living in an unirrigated landscape in a house that may have been built in former sand hill. But if you do have a lower lying area, it'd be a great place for it. Another of the Lyonias is called the rusty Lyonia. And here's one of those little fairy bees, those little stingless bees, visiting the rusty Lyonia early in the season. We get so much attention, well, we don't. Our buttonbush gets an awful lot of attention when it's in flower. It makes these wonderful compact heads, spherical heads, looking somewhat like the satellite Sputnik and something like the coronavirus, but it is neither. It is actually a very happy and healthy native shrub, again, for maybe irrigated landscapes or houses that are in areas where the ground stays a little wetter than typical sandhill. It is a favorite of the big old bumblebees and the carpenter bees, the big bees. They can handle visiting all those flowers all at once. Tea bush is a native Florida plant shrub, a small shrub with silver leaves. It's a very attractive plant. It's actually a hibiscus relative, and it just covers itself in these tiny little pinkish mauve hibisci flower almost all year round. It's not naturally found in Pinellas County. Its home base is kind of southeast Florida, but it is certainly happy in landscapes, and it would take a very hard freeze to knock this one out. It's one that, if you want to watch bees have this one plant, it will bring them all in, and it's called tea bush or silver shrub. Here we have one of the mason bees visiting that tea bush, sticking her tongue down into the flower to access that nectar. And as for herbaceous plants, I mentioned earlier that pennyroyal that flowers in January and February. It has very, very fragrant leaves. It's an herb. Pennyroyal is an herb. I have heard anecdotal stories about using the leaves for tea, but we just let it grow and let it flower very early in the season and watch the pollinators emerge and come to visit it. Tiny little blue mason bee visiting the pennyroyal in February. Another one of the great photos by our Clint. Blue-eyed grass is a plant that can kind of wiggle into the landscape. It can grow up and in between other plants and use other plants for support. There's a couple of different species of blue-eyed grass. There's one with grass leaves, and there's one named after somebody called Nash. Either way, it's a great early flowering February and March nectar and pollen source. It's an iris relative, and the flowers are really cool viewed up close. They're small, and they're perfectly suited for some of our smaller burrowing bees. In addition to the compass plant, we have a native sunflower called green eyes that will flower most of the year. It's not a one and done. A lot of our native wildflowers are, they'll flower for a couple of weeks and then wait until the same time the following year. But green eyes kind of keeps going. And being a composite, it keeps producing those tiny tubular flowers that are beloved by so many bees. And there's a lot of composites to choose from. Sunflowers, Pityopsis, Coreopsis, Helianthus, Balduina, all the yellow composites. Take your pick. Some are easily grown from seed, some are available to grow as plants. Just introduce a lot of yellow composites to your garden and you will get the bees. Blanket flower, which has recently been dethroned as a native, dethroned as a Florida native. It was apparently only naturally found in Central and South America, but it's perfectly home here and it doesn't seem to be doing any damage. We wouldn't evict this one from the garden just because it doesn't have the right papers. Purple thistle, if you can bear it, if you can bear to sacrifice a corner of the garden for one of the most imposing rosettes of armored foliage, you will be rewarded with a huge purple thistle around April. And just watch for the bee diversity to come and visit the giant purple thistle. And this blood bee, I believe this blood bee is so called. It's another one of those uh, kleptoparasites that kind of hangs out waiting for the lady to leave for work, and then she goes and steals her babies. Again, it's not Snow White out there, but dang it, aren't they cute? Despite their despite their life cycle. For ground covers, we'll just finish up with sunshine mimosa. Everybody loves this plant. It's a great plant to include in a lawn. It can be mowed, and it's that brush shape that the bees love. And the ubiquitous turkey tangle frog fruit or fog fruit, whatever you want to call it, matchstick plant. No yard should be without this plant. It's often targeted as a weed, but it's the host plant for a couple of different butterfly species. It makes these tiny little flowers that are perfect sized for our miniature wildlife. And what's the best practices for keeping bees in our garden? Well, first is to do exactly what you've done today, to learn that there is a lot of diversity in our native bees. And not everything is out to get you. In fact, most things are not out to get you. These are Our native bees are not territorial towards people. They're not defending a hive. They're not aggressive. They just have work to do and they're busy doing their work. They're busy collecting their nectar. They're busy collecting their pollen, and they are obliging in allowing you to watch them work. And it's very, very rewarding to watch these little hardworking bees at work. Learn about things like the pebble bee that can actually lift little rocks, and build stone fortresses for her offspring. How cool is that? We have these critters among us, and they deserve a place to live. Um, think like a bee. What do you want? What do you need? What's a bee going to think of this landscape? Not much, right? Make a commitment to provide for bees and provide for them for the entire season. Here's a landscape that gets it mostly. We have a lot of diversity. We have some native plants. We have different kinds of flowers. But there's a little bit wrong here. Here's a plant called mondo grass that doesn't really provide much. And this mulch is too thick for our burrowing bees to get through. Um, pine bark, Pine needles are a good mulch. Try not mowing. Try putting the mower away from November to May, all the way to the beginning of May. Just don't, just start mowing in May and set the blade very high. If you can stand it, you will have an abundance of very, very happy native bees, and you will do a huge difference. And we all like flowers. Have as many as you can. Have as many as you can stand. Um, Here's one of those little resin bees on silk grass, another native wildflower. Choose your plants wisely. Go to native plant specialist nurseries. They know what they're talking about. They know what the plants are. The big box stores have certainly plenty of flowers and certainly lots of sources of nectar. But remember that rose that was all hybridized? Some of the plants that you can get in big box stores don't really have anything that's accessible to bees. Also, they might have been treated with pesticides because to the big box stores, anything that's going to interact with their plants, they don't want, so they'll just poison it away. So just be careful when you're making your choices. And there's more to life than eating. Here's a sleeping bee. And since most bees nest in the ground, become tolerant of bare patches. I know this isn't going to go over very well, but I have to say it. Be tolerant of bare patches in the lawn. I know it. The bees need bare ground to burrow through. If you do develop bare patches, maybe just cover them with pine straw. Make it look intentional, and the bees will thank you for it. Maintaining a thick lawn can be done. Consider sharing your lawn space with maybe, if you can handle it, a third bare ground. Just give it a thought. Think about how you might do that. If you're going to mulch, use your own leaves. Don't throw leaves away. They're full of nutrient. They're full of sleeping bees. They're full of oftentimes moth pupa. So when the leaves fall, keep them around, keep them on your property because they're full of things that you would probably need to buy and reapply later. So keep your leaves. Luna moths will put their pupa in fallen leaves, and it shudder to think how many have been carried away in the end of the year or in February when our leaves fall. And when things die back at the end of the rainy season or the beginning of the cool season, leave it. Just leave things as they are. Let the seasons go through their own, or maybe even just leave a little bit. Leave a little bit of the fallen, a little bit of the past, a little bit of the fruited or seeded, because there might just be a carpenter bee or some other crevice bee that's looking for a hollow. And you might just be providing that if you just leave things like they are. Another little bee searching for a crevice in a hollow stem. And if you want to put up a bee house, we certainly wouldn't discourage you from putting up a bee house. They can be quite complicated, or they can be very simple. They can be homemade or bought. Sometimes they're called bee houses. Sometimes they're called bee hotels. And these are um, those tubes, those excavation tubes that can be moved in to by the crevice nesting bees, the leaf cutters, and the mason bees in particular. Here you can see the little mason bees making their cement, sealing them off. A mud puddle is where the mason bees get their raw materials. So if you have an overhang that doesn't have any grass growing, that's a good thing. If you see holes being cut out of the foliage on your plants, don't start spraying. You've actually encouraged and you're providing for the leafcutter bees. Tolerate that. And you can provide these easily affordable or ready-made or easily made little tubes. Um, doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be Pinterest worthy, but it does help to keep it clean. Once the tubes are full and they're emptied again, I don't think another bee is going to want to move into it. So it's a moving feast. It's something that you will need to continually add to. Look at them. I mean, how much fun would that be? And again, they're not going to defend this, so you can get right up close to it. It's not like you're trying to observe a colony of paper wasps or hornets or anything like that. These are solitary bees. They're just doing their thing, and you can get kind of close and watch them do their thing. Just a few things about bee houses. We'll finish up. Use natural materials, obviously. Disinfect it every 1 or 3 years, or completely start over again every year or every 3 years. It's best if these things are um, provided with an overhang so they stay dry. East facing is ideal, but not required. Of course, the sun rises in the east, so that's a good way to get things warm and dry first thing in the morning, and then it provides the afternoon shade when the sun is going down a different direction. That's just ideal, but it's certainly not a deal breaker. Um, Stagger the openings. They're not all at the same level. About 5 feet off the ground, which is good viewing height for most kids and grown-ups as well. And if you really are into it, when you see one of the tubes with a final cap on the end, you can take it out of the bee hotel and put it into an emergence box that has a small opening for the adult. Um, But that's if you're really, really into it. You can certainly learn more about bee houses by a simple Google search, especially with the research-based information like that comes out of North Carolina State Extension. We do, for more information about Bee City USA, we do have a web presence on the Pinellas County .gov website. A little bit more about the Bee City resolution and the efforts that we're doing to um, protect our bees in Pinellas County. We are encouraging pollinator-friendly practices, people reducing the use of pesticides, getting involved, going to classes, and we've started creating some habitat in a few of Pinellas County parks where we've stopped mowing to allow the wildflowers to grow. So we'll be sure to interpret that so that people don't think that we're just being lazy, that we're actually intentionally trying to leave some non-used turf area to return to wildflowers. So learn more about that and more. Um, if you want to see Liz do a fantastic job of interpreting our native bees here in Pinellas County, there's a recording of her webinar, which was done last year. You can access that through the Pinellas County Extension YouTube channel. And there's a link to that recording here on your screen if you want to go straight to it. Otherwise, check out the Pinellas County Extension YouTube channel. And you can find this presentation called Surprising Native Bees of Pinellas County. A wonderful presentation. So it's time for me to butt out of your life. I'm glad that you were here to spend this hour together. I'm glad you took some time out of this hot day to cool off and hopefully learn a little something about our native bee species, maybe get more interested, maybe just gain a new perspective or the desire to go out and look. The great news is our native bees don't wake up until about 10 in the morning. So you can give it a little bit of a lie-in and then go out bee hunting. Between 10 and 12 would be great. Then they come back out towards the evening. So they're just like us. Thanks so much for your attention today.